Hey guys, it's me Dawson from Decoders. So in this session I'll be talking about firmware. So let's move on. So what is it? So firmware is a software program or a set of instructions programmed on a hardware device. So it is a layer between the hardware and the software. So in the sense the if you take this as the hardware and if you take this as the software, the firmware will come somewhere in between of this. So this is called as the firmware. So it is a layer between the hardware and the software. So it's also called as the embedded software. It is non-volatile in the sense the data is in the volatile in the sense the data will get flushed out, and non-volatile in the sense it will never get flushed out. So it is installed on the ROM chips. ROM chips in the sense read-only memory chips. That is, we are having ROM, that is read-only memory. We are having programmable read-only memory, and EEPROM, that is electronically just a second, sorry for the interruption. This thing erasable programmable memory and flash chips also. So we are having that. So next, these are some of the examples of where you can find the ROM. So the BIOS is found between the IBM compatible personal computers. So you can find there BIOS. In BIOS, you can find the firmware. So next is in the iPod's control menu. So in the iPod's control menu, you can find the firmware in that. So firmware is used there. Firmware is in every electronic device you can think of. So in every electronic device where you can think of, you can find firmware also. So next, the operating system on a router is also called as the firmware. So in the routers, if you are having one old router, like I'm having an old router at home, which is the Zyxel and Binatone router we had before. So inside that, the operating system also it runs on firmware. And even in Xbox 360, if you are a hardcore gamer, not like me, I'm actually not that good of a gamer, but if you are a hardcore gamer, then we are having this thing also. That is, we are having BIOS there also. Sorry, not BIOS. Firmware also is present there itself. So next, what does it do? So it enables the device to render its capabilities function. So it enables the device to render its capabilities and the function. It acts as a coordination of the activity between the hardware during the normal operation and contains the programming constructs used to perform those operations. So the examples of a typical modem, the firmware will be the factor in establishing the modem's data rate, command set recognition, and special feature implementation. So how it was developed? So the firmware was developed by the low-level programming languages or the machine languages, that is zeros and ones. Machine level language in the sense zeros and ones. The development cycle is complicated as regular software development. So as it progressed from old to today, it has progressed a lot. So developers must have a deep understanding of the hardware product as well as the programming skills. So even the programming skills are must. And remember one thing, guys, like even in the programming space also, the languages skills matter the most, not the language itself. You need to have the skills. So it must be well tested. So we are having the firmware trends, that is it is upgradable in the sense you can upgrade the firmware also. Next, it is portable also, in the sense you can carry it anywhere you want. And it is open source and closed source. Open source in the sense it is freely editable, and closed source in the sense it is kind of a proprietary kind of a thing. So in the past, firmware chips could not be rewritten. When the BIOS became outdated, the only option to buy was a new motherboard. So nowadays, most firmware can be uploaded because it can be stored in the flash memory. Flashing firmware is also risky as the device will not boot if the flashing process is interrupted or becomes corrupted. So in the sense, nowadays the firmware can be updated because it is stored in the flash memory. But flashing firmware is also risky as the device will not boot. So what happens is sometimes if the firmware is some error, like even in the BIOS also, when you're this thing like when you're flashing the BIOS, if something goes wrong, then it can be completely gets corrupted. So that risk also is present. So next, upgradable. One of the most common features to have regular firmware updates are recording devices such as optical media drives, DVD, CD, HD, DVD, and Blu-ray. So on that also, in the sense it can be upgradable. So portable in the sense, over the past months, most devices run their own firmware. Over the years, manufacturers have found that the loading the firmware from the host device to both the cheaper and more flexible option. As a result, much current hardware is unable to function in any useful way until the host computer has fed its requisite firmware. So the firmware load is handled by the device driver. Devices like the Wireless Card Pro, the Intel Pro Wireless 200BG, 2000BG, the driver is one of the Linux kernel. So in the Linux kernel it works, but you have to put the firmware into the lib/firmware before you can use it on the device. In Linux there is a folder for firmware, that is a firmware/lib/firmware. Next is open source and closed source. Firmware goes to the open source. Example, firmware for link sys router, link Linux BIOS and Open BIOS. So in conclusion, you can state that the firmware is very important because it is the link between the hardware and the software. Firmware is getting more and more important because of the growth of the embedded computer systems. The development of the firmware is very much like the software. So in that sense, I like to conclude this, and huge shout out to Sahan Pujari from last year for his for the presentation which he has given. A huge shout out to Sahan, and thank you very much Sahan for the presentation. And as usual guys, like, share, subscribe, do whatever you want, but one thing I'd like to say is never stop learning guys. Thank you.